So before I get this video started, I want to mention a few things. So specifically, what people do when they talk about communism and the deaths caused by communism is they generalise all these countries as the same thing, as if Karl Marx's ideology has been followed to the letter in Vietnam, China, North Korea and Cuba, and that's simply not the case. So you have different variations of Marxism that are completely different to what Marx would have wanted. So for example, in China didn't have an industrial workforce, or it was really tiny, so Mao had to adapt it and make the peasants the workforce in Marx's work, the proletariat. And what he also did is, where Marx said there should be a dictatorship by the proletariat, so the workers should be the dictators, the workers should be in charge, Mao took this and said, I should be the dictator of the workers. And that seems a pretty different, philosophy to what Karl Marx had. And then you compare North Korea to Cuba, or you compare it to Russia. All these countries had their own different stance, or Yugoslavia. It's not the same. So to say that communism killed all these people like it's this monolith is crazy, really, isn't it? Like, we don't say that about anything else, but for some reason people get away with it. It's been intellectually dishonest and intellectually lazy. And also another thing, I'm going to be referring to these countries as communist for the purpose of the video, but they're not communist, they're socialist, because no country has actually been communist. Communist is the end goal, it's the utopia, it's the classless society. No country has achieved this, and no country probably ever will. So communism has never properly existed, and none of these countries are really communist, but for the purpose of the video, and because people often do it, I'm going to call them communist as well. So due to these lazy generalizations, we have a death toll that communism has caused, and I'm going to read it out for you. So apparently communism has killed 20 million in USSR, 65 million in China, 1 million in Vietnam, 2 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1 million in Eastern Europe, 150,000 in Latin America, 1.7 million in Africa, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, and 10,000 in movements across the world, the communist movements. And people say it's in excess of 100 million people have been killed by communism since it became a big thing in like the 1840s. Now, like I said, I find this really intellectually lazy. So the USSR and North Korea don't have the same style of communism. Some would even argue that North Korea isn't actually even a communist state. And in fact, I would argue that it's more like a feudal monarchy. Communism doesn't normally have one family in power for 3 generations. And I also think it's quite ironic why it says 1 million Vietnamese have been killed by communism, but I'm going to get into all that in a moment. So for example, in the 1950s, China wanted to get ahead, or Mao wanted to get China ahead for its industrial revolution, I guess. He wanted to industrialise the country really quick and produce lots of steel. So what Mao did is he told the peasant farmers to melt down their tools to make some nice steel for him to export to other countries to sell. Now this steel was really, really bad quality, so no one wanted to buy it, and now the peasants didn't have any tools, so millions and millions of them starved to death. I didn't remember reading anywhere in Karl Marx that he says, if you want to get metal, tell all the peasant farmers to melt down their tools and then try and sell it, and they'll all starve to death. Is that really a part of Marxism or communism? No, it's not. And like I said, many of these countries had their own stance in it and completely warp what it really is. But yes, using this logic where we all throw in communist countries into one little box, I'm going to do the same with capitalist countries, and we'll see how far we get with how many capitalism has killed. So for this, I think I'm just going to focus on military conflicts, and let's start with the first proper modern military engagement of, modern times, and that is the American Civil War. So 600,000 died in the American Civil War. And how is this capitalism, I might hear you ask? Well, it's all about, the southern states, they relied on slave labour for their economies. And, there's all the racial element as well, but at the end of the day, it's an economic argument. So these two went to war over capitalism. I guess it's capitalism versus morals, but it's still a capitalist war, isn't it? And then we go to World War I. 37 million people died. And, this is a massive capitalist war. All these empires fighting each other for territory. The British expanding their empire in the Middle East with the French, Russians and Germans talking about historic rights to places. That's a capitalist war. So 37 million died in that. And we're skipping a lot, but we're just going to focus on the major one. So let's go to World War II. The estimates from 50 to 80 million people died, and this is another massive capitalist war. Nazi Germany, just like the Imperial Germans, want to make their own empire. You want to expand their territory, and there's no argument that the Germans weren't capitalists. I know people like to say they're socialists, but all these German companies, the state interfered a bit more, but it's still a capitalist country, and it was doing all this for capitalism. The same with the Imperial Japanese, trying to expand their empire, expand their influence, expand their markets. expand their access to raw materials, and then you have the Americans trying to stop this. And there's another dimension to look at the American interference in the Japanese and Chinese war, because that's what it was before World War II. It's because they always like to balance the Chinese and Japanese against each other, because they didn't want one threatening American interests in the Pacific. So the Americans started to get involved with that due to capitalism as well, and the British are fighting to preserve their empire, so are the French, or the Free French, after they get expelled from France. So this is largely a capitalist war. Of course, I am very grateful for a lot of the people who fought against Nazism. You know, a world with Nazism is obviously horrible, but it's still a capitalist war. And there's estimates of 80 million people dying in that. So capitalism has killed 80 million in just about 6 years in that conflict. Then we go to the First Indochina War, where France can't try and take back Indochina for themselves. 400,000 to 800,000 people died in that. And then we move on to the Vietnam War, where the Americans were involved. So 3 million Vietnamese civilians died, 4 million Vietnamese died total overall, 300,000 Cambodians, 350,000 Allied troops, including 58,000 Americans. And this is a wholly capitalist war. You know, it's the US trying to stop communism spreading through Asia. And why is communism such a threat to the US? Because it closes down their markets, it makes the USSR stronger, and you know, global communism really threatens the US empire at this time. And like I said, millions of people died. They killed millions of Vietnamese using chemical weapons, using, you know, napalm, massive bombing campaigns of civilians. If anyone wants to get a good insight into how brutal the fighting was and how much they didn't care for civilian lives, read a good book that I had to in university called Tim O'Brien's If I Die in a Combat Zone, and you'll be sickened by the disregard they showed for civilian life in that. Whether it's calling in an airstrike on a village, knowing there's civilians inside, just randomly calling mortar strikes in the middle of the countryside just to tell the higher-ups that they'd done it. Loads of shit like this, and these are just the conflicts, remember. You know, I'm not even talking about the actual, you know, conditions that capitalist economies often create within a country. So the war in Iraq killed 600,000 people, the recent one, and this is excluding ISIS and everything that's happened since 2014. So 600,000 people died when the UK and the US overthrew the Saddam regime. And people ask, oh, how is this capitalist? He was a threat. No, you know he wasn't. This is really fully debunked now. France and Germany had oil deals with Saddam that were going to go into effect after the sanctions on him lifted. The UK and the US didn't. Iraq sits on one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. You know, ask yourselves why they invaded Iraq. You know, obviously he's a bad dictator, but how many dictators have the US backed in its history, including Saddam Hussein? So that is a ridiculous argument anyway. So the war in Afghanistan, 130,000. The war in Syria, which is really caused by economic conditions, and you know, IMF have created these dictators who really didn't benefit the people. That, you know, IMF strengthened the oligarchy in North Africa and the Middle East. So this is largely a result of capitalism as well. So there you go, there's 400,000 in Syria. The death toll is probably going to go higher when people, you know, the conflict ends and people investigate it more. And that is just the last 100 years. So if we're going to be generous with what the definition of capitalism is, let's think about the government regimes in Cuba, Chile, Panama, Thailand, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Syria and South Africa throughout the Cold War. How many people did they kill in their own countries when the war wasn't going on? And if we're going to, you know, keep talking about capitalism, why don't we talk about the Native American genocide in America? Why don't we talk about the Spanish genocide of Native Americans and Africans in South America, you know, working these people to death in mines, you know, just killing them through military conquest and generally oppressing them. This is all for capitalism. It's all about the empire. So then you go to the transatlantic slave trade or the Barbary slave trade. Two sides of the same coin. I know right-wingers have to point out, oh, you know, the US stopped slavery even though they started transatlantic slavery, and the Barbary slave trade was worse. Well, it's both for capitalism. Slavery is capitalism. And you know, think how many people died in that system. Napoleonic War, 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession. You know, all these imperial wars, how many people do you think died? The wars between the Spanish and the Ottomans, the wars between the Austrians and the Ottomans, all the Crusades, all the European wars, all the wars that Rome fought. You know, this is what I'm saying. It's such a lazy definition of communism. Look what I can do with capitalism. And I'd say capitalism has killed more like we could have a standard definition of capitalism that has killed way more people than communism anyway. But let's be really broad. You know, I can put the Roman Empire in with the Vietnam War if you want me to, because that's how lazy people are being when you criticise communism, because you're not being intellectually honest, and that's what people like to say on the right a lot of the time, but you're not. You're saying that North Korea, Yugoslavia, Cuba and Russia are all the same, and that's just not the case. And that's the same with me. You know, a lot more, I'd say there's a lot more similarities in the Roman conquest and American involvement in the Vietnam War than there is in North Korean communism and Cuban Marxism. Do you know what I mean? It's not the same thing, and this is what pisses me off. Sure, lots of horrible things happen under communist systems. I'm thinking about the gulags in the Soviet Union, I'm thinking about the famine in China, and I'm thinking about North Korea. But it's really dishonest to say that communism has killed more than capitalism. Capitalism has killed far more people than communism ever will or ever hope to, because it's been around for about 4,000 years. And if we take the last 100 years, I'd say capitalism would still win, and who has killed more. So this is why it's an annoying and lazy argument to make. And like I said, with my China example, Karl Marx didn't tell these countries to kill people. I remember on Karl Marx's 200th birthday the other day, people were like, thanks Karl Marx for killing hundreds of millions of people. He didn't advocate for the stuff that led to these deaths. He didn't advocate for gulags or causing massive famines, or causing, you know, in North Korea today, concentration camps. Just, you know, if your great granddad committed a crime against the state, then you'll be put in prison for your whole life. I don't remember Karl Marx ever saying stuff about that. And this is why it's so frustrating and such a ridiculous argument that communism has killed more than capitalism. Anyway, let me know what you guys think, and if you're on Twitter, follow me at the Tabernacle. If you made it this far, thank you for watching.